Download the slides and go through them along with the video and audio. You still need to make notes and try and express things in your own words. This is important for your own understanding. You still need to go through your manual and do the work points. You still need to explore further through additional reading and online investigation. For example, YouTube has some wonderful resources. While doing online learning, it becomes even more important that you do these things. You'll need to manage your own time and take more responsibility for your own learning. Look at these photographs of people playing football. What you can tell is that clearly there must have been something that came before these events and probably something that came after. But by themselves, the photographs don't tell you a whole lot about the game. If I were to suggest to you that you should try and learn the rules of football just from a set of photographs like these, I think it would be actually really difficult. Now, sentences are kind of similar. In a way, sentences are snapshots of a particular word order at a particular time in a particular language. However, sentences are much more than that. They are derived, which means that they are created in your brain, and they are transformed, meaning that there are various changes that happen to them. So a sentence, although it looks like a fixed word order, is in fact a snapshot of a much more complex process. If one were to learn the rules of football, it would be much better to see it dynamically, either as part of a TV footage or film reel, or in an abstract way, like the following, where you can see a ball starts off at the center, is passed to various players before ultimately being headed into the net. This we can think of as a kind of a gameplay, a strategy that a team might use in order to win a goal. Sentences are somehow similar. They can be viewed abstractly as involving a certain set of movements and transformations in order to derive a completed sentence. So, if we do want to build the metaphor of syntax being a game, what are the rules? Well, the very first thing you need to do is select some words or some items from your mental lexicon, and then you need to apply your phrase structure rules to generate a basic structure. And we do this by putting the component bits together to make constituents, and we put the constituents together to make bigger constituents, etc. This is called merge. Merge is one basic rule of the syntax game, and it involves putting things together. The second basic rule of the syntax game is agree. This involves applying agreement rules that will ultimately yield inflectional agreement, such as third person singular, present tense, past tense, etc. For the purposes of this module, we aren't going to dwell too much on agree, but please remember that it is there and don't forget about it. The third major rule is called move, and what this involves is taking a constituent and moving it to another point in the structure. So once we have selected words from the lexicon, our three basic rules of the syntax game are merge, agree, and move. And by applying these three rules over and over again, we can gradually build up syntactic trees. And you've already had some experience at drawing those, and they might look like something like this. Still building on our idea of syntax being a kind of a game, once we've got the rules set out, what is the playing field? So the playing field starts with a lexicon or a set of words in your head, and from those you select a selection of them, and that is called enumeration. We haven't emphasized enumeration in this module, but it is basically just a selection of words from your mental lexicon. Once you've got that, you start the process of merge, move, and agree. You take two words from your enumeration, you merge them together to make a larger constituent, perhaps a determinant and a noun, make a noun phrase. Then you repeat the cycle of merge, move, and agree. Perhaps you take a verb and you merge that with your noun phrase to create a verb phrase. And then perhaps you would take a head infil and you would merge that with your verb phrase to create an IP. Finally, you would take another noun phrase and merge that with the IP to create a subject. So there's a cycle of merge and move and agree that gradually build up a sentence structure. Once you've got a completed sentence structure, you reach a point called spell out. And spell out has basically two parts. It sends one copy of the syntactic tree that you've built to something called PF, which stands for phonetic form, and this links up to the sensory motor systems in your brain. Ultimately then, at this point, this syntactic tree is turned into a sentence with linear order, with actual words that have instructions to your mouth and lips to articulate them in a way that can be understood. Simultaneously, on the other hand, spell out makes another copy of the syntactic tree that we've built and sends it onto LF. LF stands for logical form, and this is linked to the conceptual and intentional systems of your brain. So basically what this does is take that syntactic tree and looks at it for meaning and tries to interpret what does it mean. So ultimately our syntactic tree has two parts to it. It's got a phonetic part that involves speaking out or enunciating the sentence in a particular way. And the other part of it is the meaning that is associated with it. Now that might be a little bit abstract, so let's think if we can't put it in a slightly different way. Let's imagine that you wanted to write a Valentine's letter, and you would do that by writing a draft on your computer, and as you go along you might add a paragraph, you might move some paragraphs around, you might delete some stuff, and you might rewrite it and add some more paragraphs. So there's a cycle of writing and editing and deleting and rewriting, and ultimately you get something that you think might be an acceptable love letter. Well, once you've got it, it's kind of pointless just having that Valentine's letter on your computer. You've actually got to send it somewhere. So you send it to the printer. Now the printer is the equivalent of spell out in our syntax game. And what the printer does is two things. On the one hand, it converts the electronic file that is on your computer into a physical paper letter. And that process is called printing, of course. And this would be more or less the equivalent of PF. Simultaneously, though, what your printer is going to do is write the address of the person that you're sending the letter to onto an envelope. So you might put an envelope into the printer, and out the other side comes this beautifully addressed letter. And let's imagine that this is something like LF or logical form. So both of these parts of the letter are really important for the letter to be read and to get where it needs to go. Without the envelope and the address, the envelope is never going to be received by the person you want it to be received. On the other hand, if you just have an empty envelope with nothing inside, then your Valentine isn't going to be particularly impressed. So it's important to have both an addressed envelope and also a love letter that you have inside it. So this might be a slightly different way of thinking about that syntax game, but hopefully it gives you the basic idea. So now we've outlined the rules of the game and also the field of play. Let's see how we can start to derive some real-life sentences using the simple tools that we've put together. And let's start with a yes-no question. And the example I'm going to look at is, have you seen a clown in my bedroom? And we're going to start out by taking our verb see and merge that into a verb phrase. And then we're going to take a determiner and a noun and put those together and merge those as the object of the verb phrase. Then we're going to take a preposition and a noun phrase and merge those together to create a prepositional phrase. And we're going to link that or merge it with the verb phrase to create a prepositional phrase in my bedroom that modifies the verb phrase. Then we're going to take an auxiliary verb like have, and we're going to merge that with our verb phrase. We take infill, which is present tense at the moment, and we're going to merge that with the verb phrase to create an inflected clause. Finally, we're going to take our noun phrase, which will ultimately be our subject, and we're going to merge it onto the IP there. And this creates a basic inflected clause, something like, you have seen a clown in my bedroom. And this entire tree has been created by the process of merge. And merge in this sense is really just about taking different words and putting them together to create constituents, and then putting those constituents together to make bigger trees, eventually resulting in a fully formed clause. Now this is where move comes in. One of our rules involves auxiliary to infill movement. At this point there's nothing left to move, and so we revert to the merge process. And we're going to take our CP and merge a comp, and then we're going to apply another movement rule, infill to comp movement, and that's going to take the auxiliary verb and move it into the comp position, and that's going to give us, have you seen a clown in my bedroom? Which we will all recognize to be a yes-no question. Of course, once we have this whole big tree structure, it would be sent to spell out, and spell out would turn this tree into a meaningful object for your brain to interpret on the one hand, and on the other hand, it would turn it into a pronounceable sentence. And that's because when we speak, we don't speak in trees, we speak in sentences. Let's have a look at another example of how the syntax game plays out with these three very basic rules: merge, move, and agree. And this time we're going to look at WH question formation. And the one we're going to look at in particular is, what have you seen in my bedroom? So we're going to start off by applying our basic phrase structure rules through the process of merge. We're going to take our verb see, and we're going to merge that with our noun phrase object. In this case, that noun phrase is a question word, what? Then we're going to take a preposition and another noun phrase and merge those together to create a prepositional phrase. And in turn, we're going to merge that onto the verb phrase, and then take the auxiliary verb have and merge that onto the verb phrase. So gradually, just by merging, we are building up a tree little by little from the bottom up. Finally, we're going to take our inflectional node, which is present tense on it, and merge that with the verb phrase, creating an IP, which you'll all recognize to be an inflected clause. Then we merge the subject noun phrase, which is going to be you, and this gives us, you have seen what in my bedroom? Now that is by itself is actually a grammatical sentence in English. It's called an echo question. And you'd say something like that when you are quite surprised, and you might want to seek some confirmation from that. So if someone said, hey, you know what, I saw a clown in your bedroom, I would personally find that quite shocking. And then I might say, what? You've seen a what in my bedroom? That's how it works. So the useful thing about these echo questions is that they show us where the question word, what, originally started out from. And it starts out from the object position, where in the previous tree, the clown was merged in the object position. So we finished with merge for the moment. Now we're going to apply our auxiliary to infill movement, just like we did in the previous tree. The auxiliary moves to the infill. And at this point, there's nothing left to move, so we will continue with the merge process. And we're going to merge our comp, and this comp has some question features, which is going to tell the derivation or tell the grammar that we're going to be dealing with a question. At this point, we move again the infill to comp. So the auxiliary is moved from the auxiliary position to infill, and from the infill to the comp position. And this is where we stopped on the previous slide, where we were talking about yes-no questions. Of course, with WH questions, there's still something else to do, and that is to apply WH movement. And that involves taking the question word, or that whole phrase, and moving it to CP. And this gives us, what have you seen in my bedroom? And at this point, having built the whole tree structure, this tree structure would be sent to spell out. Spell out is going to make two copies. The one copy is turned into some meaningful semantic object that the brain can interpret for meaning. And at the same time, a copy of this tree is going to be sent to the mouth and the lips and the articulation apparatus, and it's going to be turned into a sentence that we're going to say out one word at a time. There are many different kinds of constructions in English that can be built in this way. For instance, let's try making a passive. And the sentence we're going to try and derive, the ball was kicked by the player. And we can immediately tell that the doer of the kicking is the player. And so that is the semantic subject, but it occurs inside a prepositional phrase called a biphrase at the end of the sentence. The grammatical subject of the sentence is the ball, but we will know that the ball is not the doer. The ball is the thing that was actually kicked. So in this sense, the ball is a semantic object, even while it is the grammatical subject. So let's start off this derivation by applying the basic phrase structure rules that we know and love, and which are pretty much the same in 95% of the trees that we're looking at. So we're going to take our verb, in this case the verb is kicked, and we're going to merge that with our noun phrase object, the ball. Then we're going to take an auxiliary verb. It is actually our passive auxiliary, which will become important, and we're going to merge that with our verb phrase. Remember, auxiliaries also have their own verb phrase. And this is a passive auxiliary, as I already mentioned. Then we're going to take our inflection node and we're going to merge that with our verb phrase to create an IP. And note that in this case, the tense we're dealing with is the past tense. And we can see that on the verb was, which is a past tense form of the verb to be. Having merged our tree in this particular way, we're going to use the next rule in the cycle, which is move, and we're going to apply aux to infil movement. And this happens every time that we have an auxiliary or where the infil is empty. And so was moves into that infil position, and then that's where it picks up its past tense. Now at this point, something really strange happens. Now under normal circumstances, we would take a noun phrase, which is going to be the subject, and we would merge it into the IP. And at that point, the verb would assign an agent theta role, and that subject would become the doer of the sentence, as it were, and we would end up with a simple declarative clause. However, the passive auxiliary is a little bit special because what it does is it absorbs that theta role. It prevents the agent theta role from being assigned to what would have been the subject. And if a noun phrase doesn't have a theta role, then it can't occur in the sentence. So that passive auxiliary, by preventing that agent theta role from being applied, effectively pushes the semantic subject out of the sentence completely. And that leaves us with a bit of a problem because every sentence does require a grammatical subject of some kind. So clearly we can't leave the tree in its current state. It feels very incomplete. And so the next rule that we might want to apply is something called object to subject movement. Now the object in this case is the ball, and it has already received a patient theta role from the verb kick. So that is why it can be in the sentence. And what happens here is that that noun phrase moves into the IP position and becomes the grammatical subject. So what we've seen here is that the semantic object moves to the front of the sentence and becomes the grammatical subject. And this gives us the sentence, the ball was kicked. And this would be perfectly adequate. It's a grammatical sentence. There's nothing wrong with that. However, there's an optional next step that we could take, and that is to merge a prepositional phrase called the by phrase. So what we might do is take a noun phrase like the player, and we're going to merge it with a preposition like by, and then that prepositional phrase would be merged with the verb phrase. What's interesting about it is that prepositions also assign theta roles. We talked about that a little bit in a previous lecture. And different prepositions will apply different theta roles. And in this particular case, the preposition by assigns, would you believe it, an agent theta role. So by merging this particular kind of prepositional phrase with our verb phrase, we are actually providing the semantics of a semantic subject. And what this means is that there was a ball kicking event which was enacted by the player. So in this way, even a passive sentence can encode the notion of agenthood, even though the object of the preposition is definitely not the grammatical subject. So I hope this gives you an indication of how a generative grammar might work and how we would go about building some sentences. A generative grammar is a bit like a game plan for language. It generates or creates the structures of language through specific yet relatively simple rules. And what are these rules? They are merge, putting things together, move, moving things around, and of course agree, which we haven't discussed in much detail. And a sentence is derived or created through successive cycles of these rules. Merge, move, and agree. Merge, move, and agree. Merge, move, and agree over and over again. This process creates tree structures which determine the meanings of sentences. And that is one of the reasons why it is so useful to be able to draw these trees, because it is a good way of capturing the meaning of these sentences. While our examples here have unfortunately been limited to English, our generative grammar is not actually only a grammar of English. What we are aiming for is to create a grammar that can be applied to any and all human languages. And so we would postulate that all human languages involve syntactic trees that are built up through the processes of merge, move, and agree. And then what is different in each language might be, of course, the words, because we know different languages have words that are different from each other. Another thing that might be different is the precise nature of what moves when. So while all languages have movement of some kind, it might not be the case that all languages have a movement of question words at the front of the sentence. So one of the roles of the linguist is to identify these transformations for all human languages and to identify which ones are universal, that is, which apply to all human languages, and which ones are language specific. And as we go through that process of looking at different languages and applying these insights, we hope to discover a basic scientific linguistic toolbox that we can use to describe and explain all human languages. What do we call this toolbox? We call it universal grammar, and that will be the subject of our next lecture.